We're just going to go ahead and start our meeting, and our first speaker is going to be Marci Cohen. Marci Cohen is a reference librarian at Berklee College of Music. She recently completed a Master of Arts in Music at Tufts University, and her presentation today is an adaptation of her master's thesis. She earned her Bachelor of Science from Wharton School of Business at University of Pennsylvania and her MLS from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She came to music librarianship as a transition from music journalism focused on popular music. Earlier in her career, she interviewed Iggy Pop twice, and she occasionally still writes album reviews. Prior to Berklee, she worked at the RollingStones.com and the Northbrook Public Library in Illinois. So, and her presentation is called The Stooges, How I Wanna Be Your Dog, uncovers the ascensions of younger boomers and older Gen Xers. So without ado, here's Marci Cohen.
Thank you very much. Let me adjust this. That. There we go. Okay. So, as Zoe mentioned, this is an adaptation of the thesis that I completed last spring for Tufts. When talk show host Dinah Shore asked Iggy Pop, former lead singer of the Stooges in 1977, "Do you feel your music had a chance to contribute something?" he responded, "I think I helped wipe out the 60s. Decide for yourself. Let's revisit August 1969. For those of you not familiar with this is Jimi Hendrix performing at Woodstock. In contrast, this is what the Stooges unleashed on the world that same month. Oops, sorry. Sorry. So, I Want to Be Your Dog, a track from the Stooges' eponymous debut, was such a stark contrast to the dominant hippie aesthetic that it is widely reported as having been released the same week as Woodstock. But being the intrepid research geek that I am, I discovered that it actually came out a week and a half before the famous music festival. However, Iggy Pop's blunt assessment of the Stooges' impact was so on target that the clip from Dinah opened the video introduction of the band when they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2010. While the band's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame gave them a stamp of validation, they held a tenuous grip on their position within the rock canon. Their debut album was met with commercial indifference, peaking at number 106 on the Billboard album charts, selling a mere 32,000 copies in its first year. Critical reaction within the recently established field of rock journalism was decidedly mixed. However, the album has gained stature over the years, hailed as a radical shift from the rock music that preceded it, a rejection of what had quickly ossified as rock convention. Derided by some for its simplicity and implied stupidity, others embraced it for stripping away the layers of unnecessary virtuosity and bloat, a crucial foundation in the formation of punk. While the band attracted a small clutch of supporters among their contemporaries, their critical mass of backing came from younger musicians. Rather than splitting along obvious generational lines, that cohort spans both baby boomers and Generation X, although it notably begins with those who are too young to have attended Woodstock, at least under their own volition. That age divide manifested itself in the split reaction of the audience, either enthusiasm or discomfort, when the band performed I Want to Be Your Dog, a song from their debut, at the induction ceremony. The audience response to the Stooges, both specifically in their performance at the ceremony and more generally since the band formed, highlights an overlooked aspect of the analysis of generations in the United States. Strauss and Howe, whose book Generations defined the baby boomers as those born between 1943 and 1960, calls Woodstock a defining moment for them. Their book was published before Generation X became the common term for the generation following the baby boom, but they note that the, quote, punkish members of that generation grow weary of boomer nostalgia for Woodstock. For example, music critic Jim DeRogatis, born in 1964, talked about the punk-influenced replacements. Shoot. We're not getting sound on this one. It may just be a problem with the clip, but basically he's saying, and I will quote him, and meanwhile you've got the motherfucking baby boomers and they keep talking about, you're never gonna hear anything as great as the Beatles, you're never gonna see anything as great as Woodstock. Well, fuck you, we just saw the replacements. I think it may have just been the clip, we're fine. Sorry. But punk is rarely talked about as the music of baby boomers, even though its creators and earliest audience were squarely within its demographic borders. It took the embrace of younger boomers and older Gen Xers for punk more broadly, and the Stooges specifically, to earn their recognition. I've coined the expression Y-box to refer to younger boomers and older Gen Xers, defined as those born between 1956 and 1968. I have chosen this span because these are people who were alive during Woodstock, but are too young to have attended by their own choice. Most of the musicians who played key roles in the acknowledgement of the Stooges' importance fall in this age range, although there are a few outliers. This is also the primary age range of the punk audience, from its earliest incarnation in the 1970s until its incarnation as a major component of the 1991 grunge explosion. The original members of the Stooges were born between 1947 and 1949, the first wave of the baby boom. The punk genre that the Stooges helped pioneer was a product of boomers for a boomer audience, albeit a narrow one. But the music is rarely discussed in that generational context. The Stooges' 1969 debut was a major factor in establishing the blueprint for punk. It took until the mid-70s for punk to become a full-fledged genre and subculture. It took even longer, until 1991, for it to become a potent commercial force in the US, with punk-influenced grunge by Gen Xers. This time frame shows how punk is wrongly ignored as a genuine boomer experience, particularly for younger members of the generation. However, it is not uniquely a boomer experience, but one also shared by older Gen Xers. This Y-box age bracket has been overlooked because it defies strict generational borders. The path to the begrudging acceptance of the Stooges into the rock canon demonstrates the Y-box ascension to power, and the audience reaction to their performance of I Want to Be Your Dog at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony provides a lens for viewing this process. This highlights the position of proto-punk in the rock canon, how punk is viewed as being on the fringes by the older rock establishment, but central to a younger swath of listeners, and that the break does not fall on strict generational lines. The details herald a changing of the guard, a decline in the influence of those who initially legitimized rock, and the rising power of younger musicians, critics, and fans who redefined aesthetic values and appropriate behaviors in rock. For those of you not already familiar with the Stooges, I'll give you some background. The band formed in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1967, recording and releasing their debut album 2 years later. The initial lineup was Ron Ashton on guitar, his brother Scott on drums, Dave Alexander on bass, and Iggy Pop, born James Osterberg, on vocals. Although they drew from other sources, they had immersed themselves in what is now considered classic rock: Dylan, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and The Who, typical of their generation. Although Alexander and Ron Ashton got expelled from school for having long hair, but the Stooges are overlooked in depictions of the early adulthood of boomers because the band deviated too far from the hippie flower power stereotype. Music critic Lester Bangs described them, quote, "But the Stooges are probably the first name group to actually form before they even knew how to play. This is possibly the ultimate rock and roll story because rock is mainly about beginnings, about youth, and uncertainty and growing through and out of them and asserting yourself way before you know what the fuck you're doing. Banks overstated their amateurism, although their abilities were limited. John Sinclair, manager of the Stooges' Detroit compatriots, the MC5, observed, "He could shape the music so it didn't matter that they couldn't play too well." Denny Field signed them to Elektra Records after seeing them on a scouting mission for the MC5. Although label founder Jack Holtzman and vice president and art director Bill Harvey were, quote, completely stupefied by the Stooges, according to Fields, he brought them to the label known for folk because he held the unofficial role of company freak, a typical record label role of the era, the one in tune with the tastes of the kids, and he had success in signing the Doors. John Cale of the Velvet Underground produced their debut. As you heard in the clip I played earlier, or the clip of the clip, the song centered on a simple hypnotic churning riff, descending bar chords, G, F sharp diminished E over an E drone in G minor, bathed in fuzz. While the repeated line from the chorus, "I want to be your dog," implies sexual submissiveness, the snarl of the final line makes it clear that Iggy is the one in charge. The overall aesthetic is noisy, heavy, and imprecise. The lyrics clearly depict desire. The propulsive, relentless riff and snarl chorus make clear that this is a song of sex with a threat of violence, not peace and love. The variations on the basic riff are slight. The intention and the effect are visceral, not intellectual. The absence of 5/1 cadences is unsettling, creating a sense of motion without arrival. The band's lack of virtuosity, most notably Ron Ashton's, serves as a virtue rather than a limitation of the song, giving it a primal edge. These qualities put the Stooges at the forefront of what was to come, but out of step with their own times. They shared the heaviness of The Who, but the contrast between the bands was sharp. The Who released Tommy in 1969, an album noted for Pete Townshend's ambitious songwriting, and that served to showcase Roger Daltrey's soaring vocals. On See Me, Feel Me on that album, they used their power judiciously, while the Stooges sounded incapable of such control. The same year, the Rolling Stones released Let It Bleed, featuring the hit You Can't Always Get What You Want. That song opens with a children's choir, an innocent sound in stark contrast to Iggy Pop's lasciviousness. Ron Ashton's performance of the song epitomized his description of himself as an authentic guitar player rather than a great guitar player, only playing what needed to be played. But in that era of Jimi Hendrix, where flashy virtuosity was prized, Ashton's was not the type of authenticity that was valued. The album did not get an enthusiastic response. A small minority saw it as the future of rock, but most rejected it because it was too unlike the current musical landscape, and they did not want to touch it. The public mostly ignored it. The press had a mixed reaction, with a focus on whether the simplicity of their music and lyrics was admirable or detrimental. A review in Cream predicted that Ron Ashton's work was probably the guitar style of the future, a comment that highlights the tension that was emerging in the nascent field of rock criticism. One view revered the technical instrumental skill, lyrical complexity, and polished production that had arisen in rock. For the sake of brevity, I'll summarize this as the Rolling Stone view, referring to the magazine founded by rich UC Berklee dropout Jan Wenner. The other view was that such values stood in the way of purity of emotion conveyed by a more simplistic presentation, an outlook championed by the Detroit-based Cream. It was a period when standards changed rapidly, but the difference between the two camps and their relative power would have repercussions for years to come. The tension was still being played out 4 decades later when the Stooges were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. 3 crucial music journalists were at the center of the Cream aesthetic. Dave Marsh and Lester Bangs, the second and third editors respectively of Cream, and Greg Shaw, the founder of Who Put the Bomb, later shortened to BOMP, which declared itself the first rock and roll fanzine. In the early 70s, a theme emerged in the writing by these 3 journalists. They advocated for and theorized about punk. They used that term for the genre that would later be dubbed garage rock, but it was the template for punk as it emerged in its own right. The key elements, according to a series of essays by Bangs, were minimalism, amateurism, and finally, quote, sheer aggressiveness and loudness, the element of a physical shock. The Stooges epitomized these values. The Stooges were revered by the writers from Cream, but Rolling Stone had firmly established itself as the journal of record for rock. Rolling Stone has been published continuously since 1967, but Cream ceased publication in 1988, was resurrected briefly in the 90s, and currently exists as a brand but not a published magazine. It was Rolling Stone publisher Jan Wenner, rather than any representatives from Cream, who was among the founders of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Stooges had the support of their contemporaries at Cream, but in the powerful Rolling Stone realm, the Stooges have always remained on the fringes. Another way that the Stooges aligned with the Cream aesthetic was in the youth of their audience. While Rolling Stone assumed that their readership's taste would age along with that of their editors, Cream remained focused on younger music fans. Iggy Pop noted that early on that his band attracted, quote, high school and junior high kids who were either bad or wanted to be, plus a few of the more musically informed people. The youth of the audience is notable in both absolute and relative terms. By 1968, the band members were entering their 20s, which means that this audience was not just younger than them, but too young to participate in the quintessentially boomer hippie movement. In other words, the emerging Stooges fan base were experiencing something unique to their generation that was clearly separate from the hippie culture that is a commonplace definition for that generation. This was the beginning of the Y-Boxers. But just as the Stooges' music was largely out of step with its time, their live performances were equally groundbreaking, which returns to the tenets of punk espoused by Bangs, Marsh, and Shaw. The stories of their live shows are legion, and three major themes emerge. First, there was a split in audience response. At their debut live performance, some were mesmerized while others recoiled in horror, a reaction that would continue for years, and the band thrived on both responses. Second, Iggy Pop broke down the metaphorical and literal barriers between performer and audience. Finally, he crossed boundaries of acceptable expressions of sexuality. It's worth emphasizing that although the Stooges are a band, live was clearly Iggy Pop's show. He had enough charisma to carry the four of them, and most descriptions of their performances focused exclusively on his behavior. Although the studio recording of I Want to Be Your Dog is more of a showcase for Ron Asheton than anyone else in the band, this explains why John Cale had Iggy Pop dance around the studio to replicate their live setting and fire up the instrumentalists when they recorded it. It was evident from the start that many in the audience were horrified by the Stooges. Iggy Pop described the band's early shows in general. We were doing this nihilistic music. Audiences could not get far enough away from us no matter what kind of gig it was, unless the place was too packed for them to move. We were used to silence, especially in Detroit. As horrified as some were, they could not get enough, as Scott Ashton recalled. There are a lot of people that didn't like it, and those were the people who started showing up at every gig. They'd yell to get a response, and Iggy would tell them to fuck off. Iggy Pop also breached the divide between stage and audience. Rather than remaining untouchable with the audience beneath him, he would regularly dismount the stage and enter the audience, interacting with them, even when it was not entirely welcome. He had such a penchant for nudity that one biographer noted of a 1968 show, Iggy's penis made the first of its many public appearances. His behavior was sexually charged. The Stooges' quintessential, most legendary performance was at the televised Cincinnati Pop Festival in 1970, so defining that the photo was used as the cover of Steve Waxman's book, This Ain't the Summer of Love, Conflict and Crossover in Heavy Metal and Punk. After diving into the huge crowd, Iggy Pop emerged and was held aloft by them. They literally had him in the palm of their hands, and he figuratively had the audience in the palm of his hand. The popular hippie-friendly acts of that period did not welcome such contact. The Beatles had already retreated from the stage to the studio, avoiding interactions with their screaming fans in the process. At Woodstock, the performers were helicoptered in and out, oblivious of the medical emergencies, and avoiding the mud that typified the audience experience at the event. At Altamont, the Rolling Stones continued to perform while a spectator was beaten and stabbed to death yards away, so walled off from their audience they were unaware of what was going on beyond the edge of the stage. The Stooges were clearly out of step with their times, but they weathered on for a few years. Despite the limited sales of their debut, the Stooges made two more albums, 1970's Funhouse and 1973's Raw Power, the latter following a lineup change with Alexander out of the band, Ron Asheton shifting to bass, and fellow Ann Arbor denizen James Williamson replacing Ashton on guitar. The albums fared even worse on the charts than their debut, although the band developed a fan base on the strength of their divisive live shows. Not in small part because of their drug habits, the band fizzled to a halt in 1974. Alexander died the following year. The Ashton brothers languished, muddling along with various musical endeavors with limited results. Williamson recorded one more album with Iggy Pop before leaving the music industry to build a successful career in electronics with Sony. Iggy Pop achieved moderate success as a solo artist over the next several decades. The Stooges might have remained a footnote in rock history, but younger fans and younger musicians, the Y-Boxers, took up the cause in the years to come. The Stooges may have died, but their aesthetic eventually found an appreciative audience. The process was so slow that after the band broke up, Scott Asheton was skeet shooting I Wanna Be Your Dog singles in his backyard in Ann Arbor, observing, nobody wants to buy them anyway, why not? But a younger audience embraced them. Over the decades, the Y-Box audience rose in power, wielding enough to challenge their elders and acknowledging the Stooges' importance. Finally, the world, or at least a larger segment of it, caught up with the Stooges musically. One way this happened was through their audience forming their own bands. The Stooges were recognized by those who cared about such things as crucial proto-punk band, and Iggy Pop inspired and was embraced as part of that movement. Members of the Ramones, the Clash, the Damned, and the Sex Pistols, at the forefront of the mid-70s punk explosion, were fans of the Stooges or Iggy. When the press reported on punk, they lumped Iggy in with newer acts like Blondie and Patti Smith. The band's stature continued into the 80s, with Y-Boxers not just catching on, but paying homage. For example, Iggy Pop was in a period of career revitalization when he opened for the Pretenders on a tour starting in January 1987. Pretenders leader Chrissie Hynde, born in 1951, would regularly come out and kiss the stage in recognition of the honor of following him. The admiration by this younger generation was epitomized by a 1989 live performance of I Wanna Be Your Dog by Sonic Youth and Mudhoney. Sonic Youth, whose members were born between 1953 and 1962, is a band noted for aiding other, primarily younger musicians, making their support of the older Iggy Pop more special. Mudhoney's members were born between 1962 and 1967. Lead vocalist Mark Arm has declared that the Stooges are one of his favorite bands. They are from the heart of the Y-Box years. The performance was utter mayhem, but the audience, presumably Y-Boxers, though not visible in a video posted on YouTube, not only tolerated but cheered for this spectacle, showing how the Stooges primed the pump for a positive reaction to such a shambolic, chaotic presentation. The participation by these two particular bands also sets the stage for the acclaim of the Stooges to reach a critical mass in the coming years. For younger members of the audience, I'll explain that 1991 was the year punk broke. Nirvana, with their album Nevermind, brought the punk aesthetic that the Stooges helped create to a mass audience. This type of music gained commercial success, but it would take several decades for the Y-Box purveyors of it to wield enough power to fully honor their pioneers. Musicians in their orbit revered Iggy and the Stooges and raised the band's profile, aided by Iggy's career bounce in 1996 from the Trainspotting soundtrack, which turned his 1977 song Lust for Life into a hit. Y-Box musicians I've already mentioned, plus others such as Jay Mascis of Dinosaur Jr. and Mike Watt, most famously of the Minutemen, worked with the Asheton brothers, eventually inspiring a Stooges reunion in 2003, with Watt on bass replacing the late Dave Alexander. Despite their growing reputation, it took until 2010 for the Stooges to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, 15 years after they were first eligible. The designation came after 8 nominations and the death of Ron Asheton. Williamson expressed his doubt about the Stooges ever making the cut in an interview prior to his rejoining the group and their getting tapped. Williamson stated that he had told his former bandmates that he would join them for the induction if they were ever picked, quote. But I think that's highly unlikely at this point. They've been up for it, what, like 7 times now? Every time they get shot down. That's kind of part of being in the Stooges. We are always sort of an anti-establishment band. We weren't liked at the time, and we still aren't. The Stooges are still pretty anti-establishment. The Ramones got in, but they were more commercial than us, even though they acted like they weren't. We had no redeeming virtues whatsoever. It is significant that Williamson viewed their anti-establishment position as a permanent barrier. Both hippie and punk culture were anti-establishment. The anti-establishment stance among hippies became a virtue to the founders of rock as an institution. As the hippies evolved into the new establishment, they were less welcoming of the anti-establishment culture that followed it immediately, as evidenced by the Rock Hall shutting the Stooges for many years. The mixed feelings towards the band were evident in the response to their performance of I Wanna Be Your Dog at the induction ceremony after their acceptance speech. I'm now going to show you some portions of that performance. Oops. Iggy stepped down from the low stage into the audience, notably while singing "Now I Want to Be Face to Face," and got into the faces of the front row of tables. People merely stared or formed strained, polite smiles. They didn't sing along to the chorus when he turned the mic to them. Their sitting position would suggest that they were the most powerful people in the room, and they weren't buying it. I'm going to move a little bit further on. So, in case you couldn't hear, he said, who's going to show me they're not too rich to be cool? So, as you saw, he later encouraged people to raid the stage, something that was common at their shows in their reunion era and required no invitation. But he had few takers at this gig. Billy Joe Armstrong of the Y-Box punk band Green Jay joined him, instrument in hand, no doubt planned in conjunction with his giving the induction speech. I realized it was a little bit blurry, but one of the people up there is Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, and then a handful of less famous faces mounted the stage, and they congratulated each other on their coolness relative to the stiffs still in their seats. Everyone who joined them appeared to be younger than 50. The audience at the Raw Hall induction ceremony epitomizes the rock establishment. That cabal does not have an explicit problem with punk. Both the Ramones and the Clash were admitted to the Rock Hall in their first year of eligibility, but the suits are still uncomfortable with the changes in acceptable artist and audience behavior wrought by the Stooges. The bands tore down a metaphorical wall, allowing artists to enter the audience and the audience to infiltrate the stage. But with few exceptions, the Rock Hall audience would not do that. In contrast, there are recognized rituals among Stooges fans to sing along with the chorus of "I Want to Be Your Dog" and swarm the stage. The rituals were widespread, and they are performed by Stooges fans who are younger than the band and younger than the power brokers who legitimized rock. Many of the issues related to the Stooges induction also affected KISS, who were finally inducted in 2014, 14 years after they were first eligible and after one previous unsuccessful nomination. Like the Stooges, KISS are a Detroit-bred band that was more popular with kids and teenagers than adults, more popular with Cream than Rolling Stone, and more popular with Y-Boxers than older boomers. Questlove of The Roots and Tom Morello, formerly of Rage Against the Machine, were both on the nominating committee, and Morello gave the induction speech for KISS. In an interview at the ceremony, Questlove quoted Morello's earlier speech that swayed the nominating committee. He said, "You guys are the former guard, the baby boomer guard, and now the Generation X is coming into play. You've got to understand that every group that came out in the 80s and 90s, you can ask them, who was the band that made them want to start a band? And the answer is KISS. A Y-Boxer asserted his power, effectively." Over the course of 28 annual ceremonies, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has honored 295 inductees. Some of the speeches and performances have been particularly memorable, some have been controversial, some have been met with greater or lesser enthusiasm from the assembled guests or the general public. But the events surrounding the induction of the Stooges did something more. It demonstrated that the founders of the rock and roll establishment are declining in power, and the younger boomers and older Gen Xers are taking the reins. It legitimized punk as a boomer experience, separate from the monolith of hippies and Woodstock. Any questions? Yes?
Hey Marci, I was just wondering, can you tell us a little bit about why you chose this topic for your thesis?
Good, I was hoping hoping somebody was going to ask that. So, as Zoe mentioned in the introduction, I came to doing the Masters in Musicology from a background as a rock journalist, and I had interviewed the Stooges. I had interviewed Iggy Pop twice as a solo artist. When I was applying for master's programs, I went in with the idea that I wanted to write something about Iggy Pop or the Stooges because I suspected, correctly so, that there wasn't a lot about them in the academic literature. After I had already turned in the application, I saw that, so I turned that in in January or February of 2010, and then I saw this video. It was this very specific portion of the induction ceremony that really grabbed my attention, and the fact that they were being honored but not quite, and the just really stiff reaction of the audience. So that was sort of the formation of it, and then I built it from there. And sort of the big breakthrough on it was the recognition that the people who did come up on stage were all younger than the band, and that was how I really latched on to this generational idea. Yes?
Do you think it's possible that at this induction ceremony that it was partly also just a setting, that maybe some of those people sitting in front stiffly, if it had been a club late at night and they weren't in their suits, that they might have behaved differently?
I've watched enough of the performances to see plenty of times where even the people in the front rows are standing up and clapping along and cheering. That it wasn't just that. Yes?
The Stooges any more popular in England than the U.S.?
Somewhat more. I don't have sales information there. Certainly, the United Kingdom latched onto punk in the 70s, much more so than in the United States. In the United States, it was much more fringe. In England, it was a huge deal commercially. The best example on this was the Sex Pistols single, God Save the Queen. It reached #2 on the singles charts there, and it was long rumored that basically the charts were manipulated because people would be too offended if they were given the #1 slot, even though they might have earned it. So punk was definitely more popular there. I don't know about the Stooges specifically. Yes?
Did they stay with Elektra? And also, were there any other punk bands that recorded with Elektra?
The MC5 also signed with them. They left Elektra after that second album. Their third album was on Columbia, and then Iggy recorded for a whole bunch of different labels. I think when he returned and was doing his solo work, he was with RCA. He was on Virgin in the 80s and 90s. I'm thinking he was on A&M when he did the tour where he opened for the Pretenders. Off the top of my head, I don't know of any obvious punk bands that were that continued as part of Elektra. Yes?
The Doors were Elektra also.
Right, as I mentioned. So that was Danby Field's first success, and I'll go back and I'll show the album cover again. A lot of people noted that this album cover was heavily inspired.
Yeah.
And sort of the backstory on that one was they were in a photo studio and they had Iggy jumping around, and he lost his footing and he fell and he hurt himself, and part of it was they had to cover up the scars in the way that they positioned them.
Did
Yes?
you use the interview material in your thesis, and what was that experience?
I ended up using one quote specifically when I was, so just in trying to describe sort of the middling level of fame that Iggy Pop achieved as a solo artist. One of the two times that I interviewed him, he commented that he's not famous, but people know that there's this thing called an Iggy Pop. And he specifically said, people who go to the grocery store and buy celery know that there's an Iggy Pop in the world. So the idea that, mainstream America knows that he exists. And then another thing that came up, again, with this whole idea of why boxers acknowledging their importance, when the band Soul Asylum was at their peak of popularity in the mid-90s, They basically, I think they either performed with Iggy Pop at an event at the Rock Hall in Cleveland, or they performed a Stooges song, but they were, again, among this litany of Y-boxers who in some way were trying to elevate their importance. Yeah?
So, when did the term Y-boxers?
That's my own, I coined that myself. Feel free to use it, cite me.
You want to give us the definition again?
So it's younger boomers and older Gen Xers. So I think the years that I put on that were those born between 1956 and 1968. Somebody in the back have something? If you want to read this in its entirety, it's in the collections at both Tufts and Berklee. I believe it's available for ILL. Thank you.